When my last book, Boston Bohemia, brought me to the prize ceremony that has just been referred to, I remember Saul Bellow leading off his speech with the observation that authors invariably are better read than met. True enough. You will all, I think, by this evening's end conclude as well that this author, alas, is better read than heard. For as I suspect you would have guessed, even if you'd not been told, the divine force or whatever, though it put me in the art of scandal on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, it did not prevent 3 days before this major appearance here in Boston, and through the enterprise of C-SPAN just about everywhere else, my getting laryngitis. But I do not give in easily, even though my good friend Chris Lydon, who I must pay tribute to this evening, most of you will know is the host of the talk show The Connection on PBS, had indeed agreed on 24 hours notice to come and do the reading. And I, of course, would have done the signing if I needed the help. It never occurred to me to do the opposite. My indefatigable doctor at the Mass General, Harvey Simon, wouldn't accept defeat either, and here I am, pumped up by steroids, and with more controlled substances in my system. As he put it, he said, "Don't have an accident because you're probably illegal." And therefore I have my voice back, so to speak, for a day and a night. I am told to do my best for you. The program will be, though, I hope you'll understand, rather shorter than otherwise, because I do want to take whatever questions you may have at the end. You may observe me from time to time spooning into my throat, by the way, something that is not a controlled substance, just pure U.S. grade A honey. Portrait of a Lady, Henry James's most characteristic masterwork, is notable for its famously independent protagonist, Isabella Archer. Her portrait, Leon Edel has written, now hangs in the gallery of the world's classic fiction. She holds her head high. She possesses great pride, and there is a fierce shyness in her steady gaze. It is, of course, in my view, Isabella Gardner's gaze, as Sargent painted it. And Edel himself asserts that, quote, Isabella Archer embodies a notion not unlike that of Isabella of Boston, with her motto, C'est mon plaisir. I am very fond of my liberty, Isabel says. I wish to choose my fate. Edel continues. Isabel speaks for a society in which a woman might claim full equality, and cites the reply to a remark of Isabel's by a male character who admits she does smell of the future. It almost knocks one down. Isabella Gardner a feminist? Yes, after her fashion, which I suggest is similar to Emily Dickinson's. But then again, who recalls that Isabella Gardner's lifelong mentor was the suffragist leader Julia Ward Howe? We have preferred to recall Gardner herself was apparently not in favor of the vote for women. What we forget is that it's not at all clear she was in favor of the vote for men. Universal suffrage was not one of Isabella Gardner's causes. Well, that's all too complicated for us tonight. Instead, I want to emphasize her two overriding causes. On the one hand, art, and on the other, societal or cultural pluralism. So my reading will focus on interaction with people as mentor, friend, and patron, and her effect on the field of art as collector and designer. Then there will be a more personal rumination about her interior life. I only wish I'd known I was going to have this odd sort of voice halfway between my own and the medical voice, because the technician, Chris from C-SPAN, tells me it would be great for a love scene. I'm going to use music and musicians as an example at the beginning and read from the section of the book. Some of you will know that have read it is divided into 3 sections: Madonna, Muse, and Seductress, which is my, I hope, rather original way of writing biography, which is that while it is sequential and chronological in a rough way, it's in a way that Henry Adams might have done it. It's not tied narrowly to dates and years, but tries to capture the essence of the overriding forces of the person's life. Muse, then. The musical circle that began to emerge around Isabella Gardner in the 1880s included many names now forgotten. Clayton Johns, for example, a Harvard-trained musician Gardner thought of so highly that on at least one occasion she stood at the door of a public hall handing out programs to a concert of his, knowing full well her presence would pull in a large audience. Talk about the art of scandal. And others, William Garrick, for instance, still well known, a Boston Symphony Orchestra conductor of the time. She was the patron as well of 2 Italian musicians. The most important was the composer and pianist Ferruccio Busoni. You may have seen a wonderful front-page arts story about him in the New York Times, the Sunday Times, last week or the week before, which I wish I'd had the advantage of reading before. He was a very significant figure, of whom Gardner was close enough to that when Busoni asked her, after his not very successful American tour of 1894, for the loan of $1,000, a large sum then, Gardner sent him the money at once. Busoni, who dedicated several of his piano pieces to Gardner, went on to become a significant figure in the history of music in the 20th century. The other Italian composer Gardner helped, Adolfo Tirindelli, would today be accounted a quite minor figure. Then he was director of the Venetian Symphony. He is of interest, however, as illustrating yet another mode of Gardner's mentoring and patronage. For his opera did not fail because of any lack of interest on Isabella Gardner's part. She attended the rehearsals, the Venice opening, encouraged the composer, paid the soloists, and actually reviewed the opera for the Times of London with the connivance of that journal's correspondent. When all else failed, furthermore, she helped Tirindelli, who was a better performer, apparently, than composer, to find his musical and financial niche with the Cincinnati Symphony. Charles M. Loeffler, on the other hand, would become a very significant composer. And Loeffler, she was able to help in a very different way. I have come, by the way, as a result of writing the Gardner biography, to be a great admirer and lover of Charles Martin Loeffler's music, and I'm afraid I have exhausted Tower Records CDs, but they will, I'm sure, order more. She was able to help Loeffler in a very different way. Loeffler's decision to pursue his composing, according to his biographer, was directly related to the decision to publish his music by Gustav Schirmer, as it happens a close friend of Gardner, who it is virtually certain thereby advanced Loeffler's cause. Distinctly numbered amongst the non-traditionalists, the avant-garde in his biographer's words, Loeffler was noted for playing with the Boston Symphony the American premieres of works by composers like Saint-Saëns and Lalo, while Loeffler's own music, known eventually for advanced harmony, was widely perceived as very modern and decadent. That Gardner herself was seen by Loeffler as avant-garde is also evident. She was among the first to understand him as not primarily a virtuoso, but as a composer. For violin, by the way, he was a quite famous violinist. And when Loeffler dedicated his divertimento to Isabella Gardner, it was, he said, because no conventionality was to be expected from it, and that it may stir your imagination by astonishing your ears. All apt reasons for a dedication to a person like Gardner, apt to like what he called the most original and the best work I've done. It was no idle remark. How much this composer depended on Gardner is clear in his query to her about another work. Is there any hope, Isabella, of your wanting to hear those rhapsodies later? You know I write only for the very few. I don't know why, but it is so. Naturally, I always hope for your interest, and I consider myself lucky. Excuse me. And I consider myself lucky to have you on my side. Interestingly, furthermore, the patronage Gardner showered on Loeffler, he in turn extended to Gabriel Fauré himself, building on Gardner's publishing contacts. Gardner's taste had always been sophisticated. A Wagnerite, for example, when that was to be on quite the leading edge of her era, in 1888 she presented him already in her music room. She also helped to sponsor a lecture by Walter Damrosch introducing this revolutionary composer's work to Boston, highly controversial, and was herself a guarantor of the Boston Musical Association, dedicated to the performance of contemporary music. In fact, musical events of a strikingly missionary nature, in Ralph Locke's words, occurred in Gardner's music room, including an early performance in this country of Arnold Schoenberg's D minor quartet. Furthermore, when the conservatory students, for whom Gardner had typically paid the legendary Paderewski to give a free concert, returned the favor and invited Paderewski to a concert by their best performers of only his compositions, and a protege of Gardner's, the handsome young pianist George Proctor, and they were always handsome, was praised by Paderewski. Gardner more than rose to the occasion. Gardner then and there promised to Proctor what he took good advantage of for years: tuition and expenses to study under Paderewski's old master in Vienna, the greatest piano pedagogue of his era. Notice the varied ways Isabella Gardner pushed and inspired and cajoled the band she mentored. Even with critics, she was a force to be reckoned with. A distinguished Boston music critic, Philip Hale, at first unconvinced of pianist Charles Copland's artistry, allowed Gardner to bring them together. According to a music historian, thereafter, Hale listened to Copland with understanding. Usherette, publisher's agent, impresario, initiator of ideas to set this or that poem, she first introduced Loeffler to the poetry of Verlaine that he so successfully set to music. Job broker, mediator with critics, financial backer, and even reviewer were just some of the jobs Gardner was not too proud to do in her capacity as muse, mentor, and patron. The legendary opera star Nellie Melba is also worth mentioning as another such at this point, to dispel any idea Gardner's mentoring was in any way restricted to men. Painters, like musicians, felt the force of her influence. And in this field, there is evidence she seemed indeed sometimes to function almost as a co-artist. Certainly the suggestion is present in the testimony of Thomas Fox, Sargent's friend and McKim's associated architect at the BPL here in Boston, the first great library in this country, who in his notes for some sort of lecture about Sargent tells the story that while at work on Gardner's portrait, Sargent, worrying about the background, stopped at one point and said, as if a sudden inspiration had come to him, "I know what it is." To which Gardner replied, "Well, what is it?" And Sargent said, "A certain piece of Venetian brocade, but unfortunately it is on the wall of my studio in Boston, in London. It would be a perfect background." Gardner's turn. "Never mind that, Sargent. I knew exactly what would be a proper background for my portrait when I decided to have you painted. And I have the other half of the piece upstairs. I will go at once and get it." Added Thomas Fox, Now that is a really good Sargent story, because it is not only typical of him, but also of Isabella Gardner. Then, by way of explaining the matter more fully, Fox concluded this excerpt of some part of a projected talk on Sargent with this reminiscence of his own. Sargent and Gardner, the painter and the subject, were in many ways quite alike and had many artistic characteristics in common. A musician who was a friend of both in the course of an evening's talk after the death of both of the principals told how Mozart once wrote a page of music to be played as a duet. There was an unusual feature of this composition, however, inasmuch as one musician began as usual and played forward, while the other began at the end, so to speak, and played backward. And the result was not only good music technically, but also pleasing to the ear. This incident was told to indicate the amount of imagination carried in the mind of the great musicians, but it also suggests, added Fox, the quality to be found in a large degree in the creator of Fenway Court. If early on art, her chief passion, became evident, the circumstances of her life made social freedom or diversity, multiculturalism, if you will, a cause she pursued hardly less zealously. And the two things probably that stand out most as I hope an original contribution in this book are my discussion of that aspect, and then ultimately what I fear not even my steroids will let me get to tonight, because ultimately it's just all a cheap trick to get you to buy the book, you see, is her work as a designer and creator at Fenway Court, which of course she completely designed, and which is a marvelously brilliant rhapsody on certain themes that, despite whatever local reviewers may think, I think have indeed a great affinity with Picasso. But I want to do the sort of multicultural section first, because really the matter of her creativity and how she amassed her collection and designed Fenway Court is almost 200 pages, and it's very, very hard to boil it down. Gardner has suffered grievously for many years at the hands of the sort who, just as they like to call Margaret Thatcher the only man in the room in the 1980s, or Eleanor Roosevelt a nigger lover in the 1930s or 40s, cannot but see Isabella Gardner in her day as what is boorishly called a fag hag. Hopefully we've got, most of us, beyond looking at gays or women that way, but Isabella Gardner's own perceptions do inform a vital part of her life and role. For example, to be a Jew in Boston in the 19th century was a different, but by no means a less vexing problem than to be a homosexual. Neither a Jew nor a homosexual, Isabella Gardner might just as well have been, as the granddaughter of a Brooklyn tavern keeper, however grand her husband or her marriage in the Back Bay of those days. Meanwhile, if Boston's emerging gay and lesbian subculture was a dominant influence in her circle, it was the immigrant Jewish subculture which yielded the most brilliant of her protégés, Bernard Berenson. Of course, anti-Semitism in Boston 100 years ago was far less covert than it is now. At Harvard, for example, in the striking words of John McCormick, it was automatic, medieval, and Shakespearean. A social attitude as conventional as table linen. But Isabella Gardner's attitudes were quite otherwise. When Berenson, for example, failed to win an expected travel fellowship, a stipend was raised to enable him to go to Europe on his own, She first met him as a student at Harvard, to which he had migrated from BU. The Gardner's contribution to the fund was by far the largest, despite the fact that Isabella Gardner was taking the risk of alienating Charles Eliot Norton, her own dear friend and chief mentor, who had judged Berenson unworthy, perhaps for exactly the anti-Semitic reasons we have touched on. Isabella Gardner would find in Berenson an inspired collaborator as a collector. Perhaps she guessed what we know now from his biographer, that among Berenson's strongest desires was to make Boston a world center of Italian art. I am quoting here from Ernest Samuels. In this aim, their mutual friend, Berenson's and Gardner's, Edward Warren, was a dedicated collaborator, unquote. It's an interesting trio. Berenson had his eye on compelling the respect, particularly, of the so cultivated and, he thought, and apparently justly, highly bigoted German Jews of Boston. Just as Warren, who was gay, was sending a forceful message to who we today call homophobes, every time he gave Boston's museum another ancient Greek male nude. But both were at the same time sincerely dedicated to art. Similarly, Isabella Gardner, when she began to collect, didn't mind at all people writing of her collection as the last audacity with which she would vanquish the Back Bay. Well, it was, after all. Mixed motives only added spice to it all. Deliberate in receiving gays and Jews and Quakers into her Beacon Street townhouse, she was no less so in receiving Irish Catholics in an era when the Back Bay was a bastion of Yankee bigotry against the Irish. Not only did Irish Catholic cultural and literary figures like the poet Louise Imogen Guiney frequent Gardner's circle, never one to do things in a small way, Isabella Gardner also received, indeed courted, William Cardinal O'Connell. No stranger over the years to Gardner's set. Her house must have been among the very few in the Brahmin orbit to which the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Boston was invited regularly and enthusiastically. She was also a generous contributor to the Knights of Columbus. She was a generous contributor as well to James Michael Curley, Boston's legendary and highly controversial mayor, who made no secret of how well he and Gardner got on, nor of the fact that Gardner gave him these contributions. I'm now in a position to confirm this. He did not exaggerate. Isabella Gardner wrote once in an entirely private letter that no one has ever seen before to Olga Monks, her niece, quote, "I had a bad day yesterday, but Curley's triumph makes me better today. I try always to stick up for a friend in need, and Curley is not a prig." These were words as insightful of Isabella Gardner as of Curley. Very few, if any, ethnic, religious, or sexual prejudices were safe from Isabella Gardner. Her wide-ranging and open-minded appreciation of what we'd call today diversity was not either only Western. She had so keen and militant an appreciation of Asian sensibilities, for example. One of her dearest friends, and perhaps lovers, was Okokakura Kakuzu, that Carter recalled she would not receive a distinguished Japanese visitor because he wore Western dress. Usually it was some artistic aspect, of course, of a downtrodden but brilliant culture that attracted her. Thus, while her sympathy with Ireland would find its strongest center in the literary revival led by Yeats and Lady Gregory, who Gardner mentored significantly, it was her love for the Church of Our Lady of Good Voyage in Gloucester that involved Gardner in the Portuguese community. Many of these actions of hers were well known enough, and have always been well known, but they have always been seen in rather an episodic way, as a series of rather flighty whims. Flighty whims, right. reflecting, it is often said, her quirky egotism. This was Mrs. Gardner, after all, not Mr. Gardner. It is only when one links her various affinities with and activities in aid of gays, Jews, Irish, and Portuguese that a pattern begins to emerge that gives new meaning beyond socialite scandalizing to Morris Carter's careful observation, quote, that the proprieties and conventions of a society where Puritan tradition still dominated were always ostentatiously flouted by Mrs. Gardner. The same thing happened, to take from the next section I probably won't be able to read, in the building of the Gardner Museum. You know, when she tore down, or when she built a wall and then had it torn down and rebuilt 5 feet away, everyone said, oh, well, this is all so flighty and eccentric and weird. Well, of course, when Frank Lloyd Wright did that, it was because he was a genius. Moreover, it is clear that some, at least, of her contemporaries, even amid all these tall tales and the meteor excess, you know, the lions, the washing of the steps, all this wonderful nonsense that's really a sort of Calvinist Boston projection of its sins onto her, saw Gardner as certainly more liberal, as we'd say today, than her husband, and is deliberately attempting to break down these barriers. This is evident both in private conversations, such as Henry Adams's to Elizabeth Cameron, to whom he wrote, quote, Jack Gardner is too good a Bostonian to care for Cuban heroes, though his wife would know better. And equally in public discourse, as disclosed in any survey of the more serious of the Boston newspapers of the period. Almost certainly from a local Boston paper, probably the Post of the Globe, the more serious of the media of the time, Gardner's circle was said to have approached more clearly the salon of Madame de Staël than that of any other woman of the 19th century. Gardner, the report asserted, quote, broke down social barriers and evidenced her belief in society as a vehicle for the cultivation of art, music, and intellectuality, thereby intending to create a social renaissance. Yet this has all been so obscured through the years. The Buddha room at the Gardner Museum is the one room destroyed of her original museum, the room which celebrated her great love for Asians and was a memorial to Okakura. Likewise, so also her involvement in the African American community in Boston, for example, has been totally lost from view. It is a sad commentary on so many things that the earliest biography of Gardner, in it, the only mention made of her role in black history, falls into the category of what is called her enjoyment of red-blooded vulgarity, by which was meant to show called the Red Moon, put on, quote, by octoroons named Cole and Johnson, who Gardner is said to have admired not only for their sincerity, but for the way they put their feet down, unquote. In fact, the black American composer and singer John R. Johnson, Robert Cole's partner, was most unlikely to have been in any way vulgar. He held a degree in music from the New England Conservatory of Music. His music appeared in Broadway shows of the period, and he enjoyed an international reputation. Not very different was Gardner's interest in the African American folk songs sung by Gerald Murphy to her, when that collector of Gardner's was brought to her attention by Sargent and Loeffler. For a private recital, they must have known would be welcome. It was while Murphy was a student at Harvard that he had discovered, in the Boston Public Library, the text of many songs sung by Southern Negroes before the Civil War, songs at that time unpublished. Sometimes I Feel a Motherless Child, for instance. Later in Paris, Murphy and his wife would sing them for Eric Satie. In Boston, they sang them first for Isabella Gardner. Her deepest involvement in Boston's black community was at the intersection of art and religion, yet another aspect of the result of Gardner's ongoing commitment to the Cowley Fathers, the Episcopal order of monks who ministered actively to Beacon Hill's black community. On the hill, they built in 1892 on Phillip Street, St. Augustine's Church. Nearby in 1895, they founded St. Augustine's Trade School, the outreach of which was widely influential in improving slum conditions. And in suburban Foxborough in 1900, they started St. Augustine's Farm for colored children. The Beacon Hill Church, a two-storied Italianate structure, it had to be torn down for the Red Line extension later, designed by R. Clipston Sturgis, the distinguished architect of the Church of the Advent, was the centerpiece of St. Augustine's ministry, as the Cowley Fathers still call it today. It's now centered on an inner-city boys' camp in Foxborough. And it was Isabella Stewart Gardner who made possible the completion of this large church, where in 1894 the first African-American was ordained to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church in Boston. A fact, when I observed its significance with respect to Isabella Gardner, that it once reminded me of when I first read in Trevor Fairbrother's seminal study of Sargent about that painter's portrait of Thomas McKellar. For, quote, this most intimate work of Sargent, in Fairbrother's words, a portrait in oils that must rank most strikingly of all the beautiful works of that master, who seemingly painted every crowned head and merchant prince and social leader of the era, is not only manifestly homosexual in feeling, but depicts a bellman of a Boston hotel who was African American. It is not the image we have of John Singer Sargent, any more than St. Augustine's is our image of Isabella Gardner. Now, I want to conclude by reading you my favorite part of the book, which I like because I think its purpose, it's the very beginning of the book, its purpose is to try to conduct the reader into the heart and mind and psyche of Isabella Gardner. I am so concerned to rehabilitate her reputation as a ditzy, flighty socialite type. And I spend so much time on her great achievements as a designer and collector and all the rest of it. I was particularly grateful for the New Yorker review, which was the one I was waiting for, that there's a sense in which I think I make every effort to try to go as deeply as the evidence allows. I'm a historian, not a novelist, into what made Isabella Gardner tick, because she's a most fascinating woman, and one that actually, in many respects, I somewhat, her weaknesses, I assure you, more than her strengths, I somewhat identify with. And it's a very personal book to me for that reason. So I tried to in the opening 2 pages of the book, convey something of this. And it's impossible to go further than this, again, without going into the whole book. So I read it to you just as my effort to redress the balance, which even tonight, I think, needs to be redressed. Comedy and tragedy. Isabella Gardner and John Sargent, the 14th of September, 1922. It was a wintry business, though it was still autumn, his last portrait of her. What was it Oscar Wilde had said? The soul is born old but grows young. That is the comedy of life. The body is born young but grows old. That is life's tragedy. This last portrait was a very different portrait than Sargent's first, painted nearly 35 years previously. Then she had been a vigorous woman of 47 in high middle age, with its striking disclosure of her strength of character, that steady, appraising gaze, and hardly less so of her bohemian nature. Sargent had looped great ropes of pearls around her very slender waist. That portrait had in many ways, in 1888, heralded her growing repute as a cultural maverick. By 1922, there was no doubt about it. nor that she had become a formidable leader in her field, muse, mentor, patron, collector, connoisseur, and designer. And a scandal, too, for so many people everywhere whom she had alternately vexed or fascinated. In 1886, it had been she, through Henry James, who had searched out Sargent. 36 years later, it was Sargent who asked her if he could paint her. She was 82 now, paralyzed so that she could no longer walk. For this last portrait, they had to prop her up like a stuffed dummy on a sofa, braced by pillows. Yet after her death, her dear friend Carina Smith, studying Sargent's brilliant farewell to his friend and patron, saw in Isabella Gardner's eyes the most improbable thing: elation. The body is born young but grows old. The soul is born old but grows young. Tragedy and comedy. It was Mary Berenson who had written Gardner, "Nothing has ever been wasted on you." Yes, elation. As soon as she could, Gardner had to wait for the return of her secretary. All her letters had to be dictated now. She wrote happily to a friend that her last portrait, no less than the first, was, quote, keeping everyone's tongue busy wagging, unquote. Adding in her ironic, critical way, quote, even I think it's exquisite, unquote. Dying wouldn't be wasted on her either. How many people die exquisitely? But there would always be Sargent's portrait to prove it. She was burning her letters now, too. There were many fireplaces in her apartment, high above, perhaps, the most unusual art museum in the world. The only institution anywhere, after all, both envisaged and designed by, and then named after, a woman, where the woman herself was seeing to her legacy as surely as in another way was Sargent. Keeping this, destroying that, she was editing her life as passionately and as determinedly as once she had formed the first and for years the greatest of all the art collections of the New World, the glories of which survived her still. Dearest Isabella, Vernon Berenson this time wrote, we all play a losing game, but you play it better than anyone else in the world. Was that why she triumphed in the end, I wonder? Did that explain the elation? She had been called the most optimistic of women. Her museum, the pride of her life, the most joyful of creations. Yet she had had to hold on to that optimism, that joy, pretty tightly in her life. The fastest of runners as a girl, as an adult, Isabella Gardner's carriages were always driven, her friend and amanuensis Morris Carter recalled, at top speed. It was her great contemporary, Theodore Roosevelt, who wrote, black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough. Thank you. I don't know if, but I'll be glad to answer any questions. I don't know how we do this. It's very large to see hands. Do you want to just sort of wander up there? And sorry?
I'll just stay in this vicinity. This will pick it up.
Oh, will it? Oh, yeah, sorry. I had visions of,
Bounding overseas.
What's his name, Letterman. I'm not sure I'm up to any of that tonight. We have to have, there's, I think, a hand up there.
I don't recall that the book addressed the issue of her restriction upon her death at the museum not change in any particular way. And I wonder if you could address that.
Well, it addresses it to the extent of simply noting it as the foundation of the nature and character of the museum as a work of art. I think there are really two basic things to say about that. The first is that as a work, an allied work of art and architecture, organically integrated each with each other, the Gardner Museum, like an interior, by Bellini, like a painting or a symphony or whatever, is a work of art in and of itself which should no more be changed than we should change the colors or the characters in a Raphael, even to the point of putting loincloths on a Michelangelo, which has been done. That's the sort of conventional and first reason. Whether or not this is a reasonable thing to do, as opposed to just some irrational whim of some crazy lady, depends on whether or not the work of art is thought to be of substantial importance and success. You try to desecrate the Sistine Chapel and the world will hate you. I have a few paintings who, if you tried to desecrate, we'd probably love you, And opinions vary about the artistic significance and quality of the Gardner Museum. Is it a great work of art or only a minor work of art? Most people try to say that it is such a wonderful time capsule of its era and of this interesting woman that it's worth preserving, to which my general point of view is bullshit. If that's all it is, it's really not worth the effort, because the art in it is really of such exceptional quality. This woman having had the eye of a hawk, that with or without Berenson, that it really has to be defended on a much higher plane. And what I try to do in the book is to suggest that the Gardner Museum has behind it a design concept which is more, it's quite irritating to curators and to museum professionals, even though it was very influential, and drives people crazy in that world. But in reality, it is in a very real sense a work of contemporary art of its era, which is designed more for a very thoughtful, educated lay audience than it is as some sort of didactic, educational museum experience in the normal sense. Isabella Gardner hated the Louvre. She hated the Prado. She hated the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Her intent at the Gardner Museum was to completely revolutionize what a museum was. Her idea was that a museum should be an experience of the joy of immediate encounter with an original object in a way that would be thoughtful. But now people say it's such a jumble. It's so eclectic. But this is exactly where I think the genius of the thing lies. And it's a controversial thesis that some people like and some people don't. But my thought is, I spend a lot of time sort of documenting it and sustaining it, and I won't try to do that tonight, I'll just tell you it, is that it is in architecture, in architectural terms, in terms of art in architecture, an architectural expression in the same era of the kind of thing that Picasso and Braque were trying to do with the collage. And I compare the different chapters of a book by Joyce, none of which relate to each other, none of which go anywhere or come back from anywhere, to the separate rooms of the Gardner Museum, which are quite chaotic. I mean, you go through the Raphael room years before you get to the Gothic room, and at the end of the Gothic room you find her portrait by Sargent, which is very modern, you know. I try to suggest that this is an expression of Mrs. Gardner's uncanny eye and ability to reflect an affinity for the artistic currents of her day. She was very in touch through mutual friends with the Steins and with Matisse and with Berenson. She wasn't this crazy old lady living in a room in Boston that people thought. She, in fact, owned a great many Matisses, not one, something like 7. And I think that the concept behind it is not only the collage, but the modernist idea of discontinuity, which is to say you don't confront someone with what they should know, what they should believe, what they should say. You don't line up 10 paintings and say A, B, C, D, and this is what it ends up meaning, and, you know, now please applaud. You don't do that. It's better if you mix them all up in interesting ways. I mean, all those installations are very closely related. I mean, every individual thing. If you look at the Titian's Rape of Europa, for instance, very few people notice the small Rape of Europa by Paul Manship, the great American Art Deco sculptor, that he gave Mrs. Gardner that's right below it. But if you mix them all up, if you stop at people, if you make them, if you confuse them, if you make them think, if you arrest the eye, if you stop the jaded mind, so to speak, some people, of course, will just be confused and go home and not like it. But other people will begin the project in their own mind of reconstructing their own personal response and truth out of it. Now, Mrs. Gardner, I doubt very much would, you know, she had an old saying, think much, speak little, write nothing. But one of her dearest friends, with whom she had a very intimate relationship, was a close friend of Matisse, was very interested in museum design, and lived with her for quite a while, and shared enormously in her feelings of what she wanted to do innately and intuitively. And when you look at it that way and you see she comes intuitively in that realm of space and art and architecture to something very similar to what Picasso and Braque do in the collage. And you can I realize this idea is so controversial. Because it's been rather forcefully attacked, even though I really don't see how it can be. It's Robert Stern, the architect, already had it of Beauport, and it was that which shone a great light on Fenway Court for me, because he didn't realize, as I knew, that Beauport was an alter ego, so to speak, to Fenway Court. It was a procession from it. Sleeper and Gardner were very close friends. Sleeper was one of the first trustees she named. And then when I tried to think about it and added the discontinuity business, it seems to me that what I call, rather vaingloriously, my dramatic reinterpretation of the Gardner Museum means that Mrs. Gardner is not only the proto-interior decorator in this country, because she's so influenced Elsie de Wolfe, but is also a very good architect and museum designer, and that entire institution, the interior of it, her settings, including the destroyed Buddha room, which I hope they'll restore someday, are works of art worthy of preservation. And if, for heaven's sakes, I'm the man who discovered three-deckers, right? And I've argued for the preservation of some three-deckers. I don't think it's particularly outrageous to argue for the preservation of the work, of a work of such artistic genius as Mrs. Gardner's interiors at the Gardner Museum. Sir?
Yes. One of the first references I ever came across to Isabella Stewart Gardner described her as a political reactionary rather than a social reactionary. I've never really pursued it, and it's always something that's sort of stayed in my mind. Can you speak to it?
Well, it's an interesting observation. There is discernible, think the best way of dealing with that, and maybe I would do it in two ways. Oh, evidently they can't hear it. Well, this chap is saying that the first time he came across a reference to Gardner, she was described as a political reactionary, but not a social. Meaning by that, I guess it would be fair to say maybe a social progressive. They maybe saw that. So I guess I'd say three things about that. One is that I would deny the categories. If you were socially progressive, I wouldn't know quite what it would mean to be politically repressive. But there is something in, there are two other things going on. One is, remember my comment about the right to vote. It's not clear whether she was or was not in favor of women's vote, but it seems as if she was not. This is very odd because Julia Ward Howe, who is the leading suffragist figure in many ways, certainly in Boston, and with a great national influence, is never made much of in any discussions of Mrs. Gardner's life. But Mrs. Gardner was her protege, and Julia Ward Howe was her mentor, and they were intimate friends. It was at Howe's house that Gardner met Oscar Wilde, for even having him, Julia Ward Howe was enormously criticized and had to take to the public press to defend herself. Even Julia Howe. So, in trying to figure this out, I remember talking with Susan Sinclair, the Gardner's superb archivist, and who was very much a feminist. And I said, well, how do how could we? And she said, well, the thing is, it's not altogether clear. She was in favor of the vote for men. And and I thought that was a great witty line. I stole it at once. But the truth of the matter is that, you see, that would point to there is a kind of certain 18th century conservatism about Mrs. Gardner was probably a Federalist in some ways, I mean, very few people in this country today remember that in Mrs. Gardner's day, you didn't vote for Senator Kennedy. I mean, how many people in this room know that the senators were appointed by the governor in those days? So I think two hands have gone up. Three. We think that this country was always this way, and we think the Electoral College is a joke. The Electoral College isn't a joke. The Electoral College elects the president. We don't. Now, were we ever to disagree, obviously, the Electoral College would go the same way probably the Queen would if she ever disagreed. But that's now. That was not then. And we're talking about Washington, Jefferson, all the rest of them. It is notable that Mrs. Gardner was a very traditional person. I prefer the word traditional, not conservative. And it is notable, for instance, you have to pick your words very carefully about these things, but the causes that she favored, that she was so progressive about, you will note tended to be people that, from her point of view, stood up for what we would call traditional values. For instance, she built the first church, she built the first church for blacks in Boston who were Episcopalian. Now, the whole thorny question of whether or not, this gets very complicated. I mean, on the one side, everyone's got a right to choose their religion, right? And for heaven's sakes. But on the other side, there were those who would say, I suppose, that blacks who chose to be Episcopalian instead of blacks who chose to be Baptist were perhaps not totally black. I remember once one of the when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, saying once, in I thought a friendly way, to an African-American friend of mine, that maybe we should have some spirituals in the program that we were putting together. And he looked up at me very archly and he said, Doug, black people are allowed to like Mozart too. And I said, thank you. And I accepted the correction, and he was quite right. On the other hand, certainly the fact that Isabella Gardner likes spirituals also says something. You know what I mean? So it's very difficult. She does tend, I mean, she did not, I compare her reaction to Cahill Gibran and Bernard Berenson, for instance. Bernard Berenson was a Jew. But unless you think it's unusual for a Jew to be all of the fine things he was, which I don't think I would, that's all right, but maybe you do. You know, I mean, you know, Berenson was not a person, he was very clear, at least as I argue, about being Jewish in terms of his background, and did not indulge in a lot of self-hatred or anything. But on the other hand, he wasn't going around, shall we say, leading a militant movement for the destruction of Italian art. You know, I mean, Italian art was his. Now, if Jews have a right to be interested in Italian art, she's a progressive. If they don't, you see, if blacks don't have a right to be Episcopalian, then she's, so this gets to be, and the same thing would be true of gays. If you were effeminate, you were not very likely to appeal to Isabella Gardner. I mean, she had a very highly developed image of what a man was. And it was, I mean, I've seen her pornography. I've seen her, you know, I don't talk about it in the book as much as people say I do. But, I mean, I know her, you know, I have a feeling for that a little bit. And it was one or two of her installations at the museum. It's very hard to say if they're heteroerotic or homoerotic. But clearly they would be heteroerotic for her and homoerotic for someone else. But again, she was a very knowing, sophisticated, intuitive woman. She certainly understood the various shadings of being homosexual. Her library was replete with extremely advanced, you know, literature on the subject. But on the other hand, if someone had arrived in drag or something, I mean, she just wouldn't have, you know, she would have, that's not the way men dress. And again, that depends on how you, what your image is of gay men. If your image of gay men is a sort of old Greek one of Hercules or something, which was probably hers because she had a real thing about manliness and all that. She loved boxing. It was her favorite sport. Then to be gay was great. And that, you know, in fact, the gayest man was masculine or something. But if you looked about the other side to it, I doubt very much if she would have been interested for 2 seconds. So that may be, she is a progressive with a, there's the story in the book, and I really go on for too long, about the way she treated the Italian workmen at Fenway Court, which was not good, which shows her traditional sort of upper class and even white. But on the other hand, there was one workman whom she observed loved the beautiful marbles that he was the only one who was handling them properly. And that workman became a friend of hers. She hired him and he became her lifelong, I wouldn't know what to describe the two of them. They virtually, I mean, he was her major domo and you know, that was just very characteristic of her, just that one particular experience. And I analyze her correspondence, and she talks about Italians in just the same way she talks about Jews. So does Berenson. Now that's interesting. You see, I mean, there's probably, in short, some institutional racism, but not personal, and a lot of classism. So there's something to be said on both sides.
Thank you.
I guess I go from side to side. There's a hand there.
I just wonder if Mrs. Gardner, she did know Matisse and Picasso, what did she think of them? Did she love their work or just hate it?
Oh, you got to read a chapter about that. She did not know Picasso, and she did not know Matisse personally either. She never traveled after, but she knew she had two close personal friends who were close personal friends of Matisse, who Matisse did things of and spent some time with, and was very in touch with them. And by analyzing who gave her various Matisses, Matisse is the third-ranking artist that she has the most people of, the most things by, that people don't notice. The first one is Sargent, the second is Zorn, the third one is Matisse. She liked Matisse, obviously, and bought two of them, or accepted two of them after the Armory show. It's interesting because you see her taste in modern art, as I try to show, but I can't really, no way to get into it. She didn't, it was like Loeffler, who was a very avant-garde composer, but there's no record of her liking Ives. She didn't like the Boston School painters at all. She thought they were very boring. All these lassitudinous women, you know, with their teacups. She didn't like that at all, even though it's the image of her era. She liked very vivid, primitive kinds of things, like Dodge McKnight and George Hallowell. She liked something that was a little to the modernist left, but not all the way. And Matisse was what she liked. Picasso, I suspect, was too much, because she went to the Armory show, and there are two Matisses that post-date the Armory show. There are no Picassos. There is a Matisse that is heavily influenced by Picasso, of which, of course, in aid of my thesis, I make much. Really, that's a very long section of the book, and you'll enjoy it. Okay, one more, I'm told. My God, have we really? This is wonderful. I don't know what's going to happen to it tomorrow. They said one night. Wherever I
read the book and thoroughly enjoyed it. I've read your book and thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was wonderful. I was left, though, with a big question mark. Mr. Jack Gardner is a totally mysterious person. And I wondered whether that was a deliberate decision on your part as a writer to leave him so, or whether there was no real evidence to describe him, his relationship to other people in Boston, and Mrs. Gardner.
Well, actually, I actually bring up all those things, but you'll observe the effect that it had on you, and the effect is correct. I mean, Jack Gardner, for instance, is the richest, most eligible bachelor in Boston, but he's a draft dodger. And yet, his best friend is a Civil War hero. You know, Henry Lee Higginson. What do you do with that? My suggestion is that his wife was so delicate at that stage, maybe he couldn't. He is described in one fugitive newspaper piece as a rather lightweight person. Likes to, you know, to sail. Easy life. He is also the man who gives the parties. Everyone thinks Mrs. Gardner gives the parties. She hated parties. She hated drink. She hardly ever drank. One photograph to the contrary, perhaps. She never ate. It was a famous, really, I mean, toast, some people used to claim, because her figure was exceptional. There's a famous house in Boston which had the best Burgundy in the world. And Mr. Gardner always wanted to go to it. Mrs. Gardner could have cared less. Great evidence. What does this add up to? But again, when you ask, contemporary diaries indicate that Jack Gardner was a man of impeccable. I mean, I know they generally tried to say nice things about people then, but they say exceptional things about him, that he was a man of exemplary honor and high personal rectitude, and that his friends would have done anything for him and all that. Well, at the end of the day, I quote Harlow Bates's fictional reconstruction of the marriage. I suggest at the end of the day that A, he might have been gay, which of course is yet another point against the book, I suppose, from the point of view of those people in the city that would find that scandalous. B, I even suggest, based upon Samuel Eliot Morrison's wonderful tale, that Jack may have had another family in the South End under another name. You know, I mean, I've really pushed the limit of the evidence to suggest, in the manner of Peter Guy at Yale, who does these things, who I admire, the reasons for this. The only thing I am sure about is that it was a good marriage in the sense of internal friendship, whatever it was at the beginning. At the beginning, she was in love. He was in love with her. She was not in love with him. Don't think she ever was. That it was a good marriage, but the phrase I come up with, which I have to stand on, is that Jack Gardner was whatever else he was. If he was from a drunkard to a highly honorable man, to a lightweight, to a yacht, whatever else he was a deeply dull man. There is absolutely no question about it at all. He is, you know, here you have the richest bachelor in Boston. I mean, please. And it is very clear that he was in an age when Julia Ward Howe's husband would hardly speak to her, where they had endless fights because Mr. Howe did not believe a woman should even speak in public, much less write books and all the rest of it. Jack Gardner was a wall for Isabella Gardner to grow against. I mean, without Jack Gardner, Mrs. Gardner would not, I do not see how she could have existed. He was essential, really, to her. So I think that, why did he do that? Well, because he loved her, yeah, but I mean, I think also that he was grateful to her for bringing such luster to his name, because he was fiercely proud of her. And everyone, what evidence there is, suggests that. She, in turn, however formidable and strong a woman she was, lived in an era when it was very difficult. God, Margaret Sargent, the Boston painter, went mad trying to do this in the 30s. Mrs. Gardner beat them all at it in the 80s and 90s. One of the reasons she did was Jack Gardner, because he supported her and stood behind her, and in effect, it was still an era where it was up to the husband to let it happen or not. And Mrs. Gardner had her own money, to be sure. The Gardner Museum and the collection was all Stewart money. It was not Gardner money. But she could not have done it all without the support and stability of her husband. It would have been almost impossible. So I think that that's what I have said in the book, and what I've said now is probably all there is to say. You know, many of us, if you sort of added it all up, because he was married to a woman about which books will be written till the end of time, let's admit that about most of us in this room, no books will be written at all. And Jack Gardner's one of them, I think. Was that even moderately all right?
Yes.